Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast starts right now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast as we continue our player profiles. Jim Eichenhofer and Gus Kattengell with you as we got a fun one today. And when we're thinking of today's player profile, Naji Marshall, there was only one person that we could get as a guest to break him down. Who was that?
That is Mr. John DeShazier, the biggest Naji advocate I know.
Well, conductor Chris Moran will give him a run for his money now. He will give him a run for his money. This is before he started working with us. He had a Naji jersey.
And for people who aren't familiar, this is how do you describe his role? Jack of all trades, producer in the radio studio,
the guy that,
pregame,
without
postgame.
him, he has to hit the right buttons to actually turn on the mics for, Graf, JD, myself, and Aaron, and you when you come in postgame. Yeah, he's our radio producer for the broadcast. So yes, he's very important.
But more importantly, a huge Naji Marshall supporter as well.
Massive Naji Marshall fan. A tear formed in his eye when he read the story of Naji saying he was trying to give away a pair of shoes. No one would take them. And for Chris, he would have put that in a protective,
glass case.
Oh, it would have been the most prized possession in his life. He didn't make that happen, by the way.
Yeah.
Didn't get some Naji
we
shoes.
need to do something for Chris, for sure.
But look, JD, to your point, one of the biggest fans here as well. I just love how he describes him on the broadcast, and we'll talk to him about it here as well as to why he sort of views and feels him that way. But it really was very easy. We were thinking of who was going to talk. JD for both of us.
In fact, it was so easy that I think if we had selected someone else, we would have immediately heard from JD, and he would not have been pleased. So, it was an easy decision for more reasons than one.
No doubt. Well, without further ado, let's get to it because it is a fun conversation. John DeShazier of the Pelicans Radio Network on the season that was for Naji Marshall. All right, Tom, welcome in Mr. John DeShazier, analyst for the Pelicans Radio Network. As always, we appreciate the time. And quite honestly, you were just drafted for this player profile. I mean, there was no one else we could have gone to talk about Naji Marshall.
No, I mean, nobody. Who's going to speak better on my guy than me, on my guy? So, all those other losers who don't want to speak more about Naji, I got plenty of good stuff to say. But no, that's my dude.
I just so many phrases. I literally, in the conductor, Chris Moran, we have an entire folder of isms, graphisms, JD-isms. And just off the top of your head, give me like 5 Najis. Give us, take it away. I mean, he's always open. Naji time. I mean, there's all kinds of different Naji-isms you have.
Well, the only Naji-ism I got right now is 8 the Great, man. That's all. That's the only one that counts. But I mean, I always say Naji's going to do something.
Always open.
Yeah, he's always open. He's going to do something. It might not always be the right thing.
Naj.
Yeah, Summer League Naj. That's a Graf thing. Summer League Naj. I mean, that's hey. Mr. Excitement.
But that's the point that I'm kind of trying to make here. The fact that when he enters the game, it's that. I mean, it's a tangible, emotional, physical. There is a feel. Something's going to happen one way, shape, or form. And I guess at the end of the day, when you're looking at players and what they mean to teams, you kind of need that.
Well, I mean, you said the 3 magic words. Something's gonna happen. Something's going to happen. And I mean, now look, we're not saying it's always good, but the vast majority I do believe is good. It's always good. The ball finds energy is what they say. It's what players and coaches say. The ball finds energy. Well, that dude's got energy. I mean, and the ball finds him, and he finds himself in some positions that are sometimes very, very good for the team, and sometimes they're not so good for the team. But I think the majority of them are good for the team just because I think aggression is rewarded at the end of the day. The scales always balance to me in favor of aggression. And so, you might have a 3 or 4 game stretch where, people are looking and saying, man, what is Naji doing on the court? And then you'll have an 8 game stretch where you're like, you know what, this dude saved 3 of those games.
Yeah.
So it's one of those situations where, you know, you live with the negatives because the positives, I think, outweigh the negatives.
Mm-hmm.
JD, clearly we selected you because you're America's foremost Naji Marshall expert. So glad to have you here for this. How would you describe, I mean, obviously, you know, you're very appreciative of the contributions that he's made and the way that he's impacted the team over this span. How would you describe kind of the evolution of how you view him, maybe going back to his rookie year or what you've seen over the last couple of years in terms of his improvement?
I think if you look at his rookie year, I think he was just a guy who was just full of aggression and energy. And I think it was not tame. He was not in control. And I think they kind of lived with that because, you know, maybe they saw what might come of it. But I just thought he was a guy who, not that he was necessarily, you know, the proverbial chicken running around with his head cut off, but he just was not under control. And so he had to kind of figure out, how do I get this aggression under control and yet remain aggressive, which is a delicate balancing act. And I think he's still trying to figure that out. But I think he's got it in a much better space than them, because then he was just kind of a wild child. I mean, you didn't know what you were going to get out of Naji. You just knew it was going to be some energy, but you had no idea what it was going to be. And now you got a better feel for what it can be because you've seen him kind of refine it, kind of channel it a little bit better. And I think those things happen as you get older and more mature and you get more games under your belt. You look at a little bit more film and those kinds of things. You're subjected to more pressure situations, and you understand a little bit better how to handle yourself and how to channel that energy and aggression. And I think that's what we're seeing, or at least what we saw this season.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I think his rookie year, the 2021 season, which was unlike any other NBA season that we've ever seen and hopefully never will see again in terms of the way that it was impacted by COVID and the way that there was, you know, limited attendance. In some arenas, there was nobody in the seats. So I thought that team and that coaching staff that year, one of the main reasons they appreciated Naji was you needed that boost of energy. You needed somebody to come in and knock some heads together, you know, run around, do a bunch of stuff, and just provide some of the hustle and toughness that he provided. But you mentioned earlier kind of the ups and downs of Naji, the experience on the court. One of the things, not to sound like too much of a basketball snob here, but I feel like one of the things I've noticed over time, in the entire time I've followed the NBA, especially as social media has gotten more prevalent, is, to me, the players that people appreciate the most are the guys that do all the stuff that's obvious. And when I say that, I mean a lot of times the great offensive players. The guys who are maybe more of a positive on the defensive end, but not as impactful on offense. I feel like a lot of times it's, I mean, to use one example, it's kind of like if you dribble the ball off your foot one time out of bounds, people will hold that against you for weeks. Yeah. But if you miss, you know, like you miss a weak side defensive assignment helping out 30 times in a row, people won't even notice that. So I feel like I say all that to kind of explain. I feel like that's one of the things about the perception of Naji in terms of a lot of the stuff that he does are things that you really maybe only notice on tape. It's not, you know, he does have a lot of highlight plays too on the offensive end and fun dunks and fast breaks and steals and stuff. But I do feel like appreciating him is a little bit more of a subtle thing sometimes. Yeah,
it's one of those things where, and maybe I'm over exaggerating here, but I think when you look at all the good to great teams in the league, everybody's got a guy like that.
Yeah,
I think you need a guy like him that can be that aggressive guy that can channel it properly. And I don't care what team you are, you just kind of need a guy who just has a don't give a you know what kind of attitude.
Hoot.
Yeah, don't give a hoot. Yeah, a guy who doesn't give a hoot. And you need a guy who, you know, because I think a lot of times what we saw with the Pelicans team was, you know, you get late in the shot clock and the veteran guys are kind of standing around like, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
Well, Naji ain't that guy. You give it to Naji, he's going to do something.
Right.
Something's going to be done. It might be a bad shot. It might be a great shot. It might be a layup. It might be a turnover. But he's going to do something. He's just going to stand around and say, okay, what are we supposed to be doing? And I think guys like that, you can live with a lot of what they do because of how they are and his personality and the way he's just always attack. He can only play 15, 20 minutes a night because he plays hard.
Right.
He can't give you a whole lot more than that. If he's got to start I don't know how you ration out his minutes if he's got to play 30 minutes in a game if he starts, because he just goes at it hard. I mean, the last game we saw him in a couple of games down the stretch, he came in, made a huge impact. When he went to the bench, he was toast. He was wiped. He was like sucking wind, like it would be us out there running around, because he just gave everything he had. He left it out there, and it was like, okay, boys, here you go. I got to go sit down because I got nothing left.
You know, he does seem like kind of a Tom Thibodeau type player. I shudder to think what Tibbs would do with him if he had the ability to play him.
He played 45 minutes. He'd be him and Josh Hart be fine for minutes. But he'd be kind of a little baby Josh. I mean, he'd play on that team because of the way he plays.
Right.
And look, I said it, and we noticed it. I think it was noticeable in the playoff series. As aggressive as Oklahoma City was, the Pelicans had two guys that I thought played well against them. That was Jonas Valanciunas, and that was Naji Marshall, the two most aggressive teams on the Pelicans roster. And I thought it was one of those situations where you get into a playoff series and you got an opponent and it's basically a rock fight. Well, you got to find some dudes who know how to throw rocks. Well, them two dudes throw rocks, okay? And they keep on throwing rocks, and they keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And I thought the rest of the roster didn't necessarily rise to that challenge, and that's how you end up getting swept. But I thought they had two guys who said, you know what, devil may care attitude, I'm going, and I'm going to go as hard as I can.
To add to that, I remember talking to you about that right after it was our last game when we spoke about that. And then in our first podcast, you remember we talked about that specifically. And it's interesting because when I think of, almost 3 seasons ago, right? When the Pels took on the Suns and pushed them to that game 6. One of the stars and one of the reasons of that game was Jose Alvarado. Naji was as well, but it was because of that, right? They made the Suns uncomfortable. They were getting Chris Paul to shove them and push them. And it's interesting because that was 3 seasons ago, but what have we seen so far through this postseason, especially in the Western Conference, JD? It's that player or two that night on a team that agitates, that's physical, that gets the ball with people hanging on them, that on a rebound in the first quarter is clapping out loud and telling the crowd to get going. It is. So it's crazy in the league that Jim and I are telling you, better shoot the 3. We need a point guard. You need this. You need, centers that can run. You still need a guy like the knife.
Well, the playoffs, to me, is a lot about who can find comfort among discomfort. So who can operate in chaos, basically. And because everything ramps up in the playoffs. The physicality we've seen, if you're watching any of the playoff games, you've seen the physicality just ramped up. They ain't no 135 to 128 games. This is all, elbows and knees and shoves and hammerlocks and sleeper holes. This is all of that kind of stuff. So who can operate the most comfortable under that kind of discomfort are the teams that are going to win. So who can play through the physicality? We're seeing now all of a sudden, like all the physicality OKC got away with against the Pelicans. Now they're in a 2-2 series, and granted it could have been 3-1, but it's a 2-2 series, but Dallas has handled it a little bit better than the Pelicans did. And now Oklahoma City is seeing the shoes on the other foot. They're turning around looking at the officials like, where's the calls? Where's the calls? Where's the calls?
Right.
We're seeing it with the Knicks and the Pacers. We saw it with Philly and the Knicks. We're seeing teams try to operate and find the comfort zone in a lot of discomfort that they're not accustomed to seeing, because the regular season is really kind of the eye candy where everybody's scoring 130, and there are 20-point wins left and right, and 20-point comebacks in the NBA, I think, than in history in a single season. And you get all that, but you get to the playoffs, and all of a sudden, man, it's a fight. It's a fight. I guarantee everybody's coming out with bruises. It's literally a fight each game.
JD, you talked about the importance of being able to succeed and thrive in uncomfortable situations, which kind of brings me to, we saw almost across the board for the Pelicans in the playoffs in the 4 games against the Thunder, almost everyone shot worse than they did during the regular season. I mean, some of that was a little bit inexplicable. I think some of it was Oklahoma City's defense. But for Naji, the guy that we're talking about, he was 6 for 15 from 3, which is 40% from 3-point range. I mean, he might have been the only guy that was able to shoot well, under the circumstances and bring his offense close to the same level that he produced during the regular season. But what I wanted to talk about with him too is just the progression that he made from when he was coming into the NBA from Xavier in Ohio as a guy who was known as like a tough guy, defender, hustle guy, pretty decent offensive player, but not really known as a shooter. I mean, for him to put the work in that he has, where he shot 38% or 38.7% from 3-point range during the regular season, shot 79% on free throws, which was also an area that he needed to work on when he first came into the NBA. I mean, I feel like we're at the point where it's like you don't want to ask miracles of Fred Vincent for every single guy that comes in, but I do feel more confident if the Pelicans are looking at a certain prospect in the draft and it's a guy who maybe hasn't shot well in college. I mean, Herb Jones the same way. That you say, like, maybe you can take a guy like that and say you put him in the gym and you make him work hard and eventually you'll get to that point. But I mean, what do you think of just the improvement that Naji's done in the way that he's gone about it?
Yeah, and shot 46% overall from the field. And what you need is two components to that. One, you got to have a coach who actually knows what he's doing when he's talking about shooting, and then you got to have a guy who's willing. Right. Because some guys will just say, well, I made it this far and you don't really, hey, you don't really know my game. And, but some guys got to be willing to take that criticism from a coach or coaching staff that says, look, we can make you better right here. This is a deficiency of yours, but we can, we won't make you Steph Curry, but we can make you better in this area. And so Naji's one of those guys. Naji, Herb, they're two of those guys who said, you know what, okay, I'm willing to work on this because if he shoots 39% from 3 and 46% overall, that means he's got to be doing something really nice from 2 to get it up to an overall percentage of that. And it's not all layups. He has improved drastically from 3-point range. He's improved drastically in terms of finishing around the rim. And so you get a guy like that, he comes into the league, and as you said, he's got a reputation as a defender. He can score a little bit, but he's a tough guy. Guys like that can, if you find the right team, and it's always about finding the right team and the right mix. Guys like that can have a place in the league because there just aren't a lot of them. A guy who says, you know what, okay, I'll defend as hard as I possibly can until you notice me. And then the rest of that stuff, I'll figure out the other stuff later. I'll get that. But I'm going to defend and I'm going to hustle, and you're gonna make a space for me because I'm going to play so hard that you can't push me out the door because I'll be on somebody else's roster doing it to you. And I think he was one of those guys where they had to kind of look at him and say, you know what, that's an element we're missing. He's rough around the edges, but we think we can smooth him out and polish him up a little bit.
Yeah. I don't know if you knew this, that Jim is a huge wrestling fan, and The Rock, right?
I didn't know that.
The People's Elbow. Well, one of his famous phrases. The People's Elbow? Yeah, he wrestled at WrestleMania. Well, one of his famous phrases is "Know your darn role."
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with knowing your role and being a role player. Sometimes I think there's a negative connotation to being a role player, like you're not good enough to be a starter. You're not good, but. JD, name a single championship team from Jordan's Bulls, B.J. Armstrong, Steve Kerr. You could name the big guys that never played anywhere else. The Australian
Bill Wennington, Luke Longley.
That's what I'm saying. You cannot win a championship at any level. Look at when the Saints won here in the Super Bowl, man. It's you can look at Breeze and things of that nature, but Lance doesn't stretch the ball out, or you don't get the onside kick, right? There's so many different things that you have to have different components to a team. And I guess my point is you can't overlook that if you want to be. It's very sexy to be on Screaming A show and have them talking about big threes and big, massive contracts, 50 mil here, 40 mil there. You got to have the guy, though, that is what Naji does.
Well, everybody on the team's got to have a role, and everybody's got to recognize their role. And some roles are just different. You don't ask some guys to defend the same because some guys are so great offensively. So you're saying, okay, we can live with him being an average defender because he'll give you 25. So you live with that. Or you can live with a guy who can't really distribute it as well as a guard because he shoots it so well. So you say, well, he doesn't handle it all that well. But I tell you what, if he got a shot, if he can get a shot off, we feel pretty good about that. And then you got some guys who you say, you know what, okay, now it's crunch time. And we got to get some stops. We got to these dudes, we got to figure out how we're going to stop them okay, go get him, Tiger. You can put a guy like Naji out there and say, okay, from the point to the 2 to the small forward, you feel pretty good about sending him out there and saying, okay, we need a stop. We need you to help lock up this dude. We need you to make sure that guy doesn't get a bucket. And you feel pretty good with him being on the floor in that role because he's shown you that he can do it. He doesn't back down from anybody. He doesn't care who it is because he's a guy who came in with no reputation. He was going to make his reputation by guarding people, and it didn't matter who it was. So he's like, I'm not going to respect you because you're, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and I'm going to respect you because you're Luka Doncic. I gotta earn my money in this league. So the only way to do that is for me to guard you.
Gus, you mentioned the 40 million, 50 million that some of the top guys in the league make.
Yeah.
The thing that's interesting though is role player pays very well in the NBA these days too.
Yes, it does.
Hey, I got no problem being a role player in the league. Do they still have that role player for a guy that comes on and just fouls people, get all 6 fouls in real quick? Because I could definitely do that. I could do that.
That guy's got to be able to actually score now, I think.
Yeah.
Let me think. There are a couple of hackers in the league. Let me think about that. But yeah, most of them guys.
Who was it with Graf this year? Was it a member of Dallas's team that came in and literally fouled like 9 times? They only called 6. He seriously fouled out like in a quarter.
Oh, I don't know.
Do you know what I'm talking about? I think you were on the road. Oh my gosh, what was it? I think it was a Dallas team. I'm serious. I think it was one of the Dallas games. There's somebody we played this year where literally he did not get cheated. I think you were on the broadcast. We gotta ask Todd that.
There are a couple of hackers. The big guy from Denver.
DeAndre Jordan? Huh? You talking about DeAndre Jordan?
No, not DeAndre, but and maybe I named the wrong team. I'm thinking about Phoenix, I believe it is. But Phoenix has got a big guy. Who
Eubanks maybe?
Yeah, I think Eubanks.
Yeah.
Who's kind of he ain't necessarily a hacker, but you don't necessarily know him for a lot of other things. So
he's got a hatchet in his pocket most of the time when he checks in.
There's very few hatchet guys. Draymond's a hatchet guy, but that's a different kind of hatchet. He's a well paid hatchet guy. But look, I think actually that role probably could still survive in the NBA because if you could give me today Reggie Evans in his prime, I would take him in a heartbeat. I would take him because Reggie Evans is going to hack out of people, and he's going to get like 1 billion rebounds, and I would take him.
You ready? It takes seconds to ask Graf. You know what's amazing about Todd Graffinini? He literally he's like a walking sports almanac of things that have happened in games. I don't know how he remembers it. While you were just answering that, I text him. Dwight Powell.
Okay.
Dwight Powell.
Yeah.
He says, the bum doesn't even see the floor anymore. It was just that one game. He came in for that one game.
I'll tell you what.
He's still going on, by the way. I must have touched him earlier.
I'll tell you what. I saw Dwight Powell put in some work against Anthony Davis. I can tell you that.
That's true.
And not just hacking him either. Dwight Powell put in some work. I think he's in a situation where they got the 2 bigs. They got P.J. Washington and they got Daniel Gafford. And now he just doesn't have space. And they have Lively.
Yeah.
And now he just doesn't have space. But I tell you what, if they call upon him to actually play, Dwight Powell ain't just like Dwight. Graf will call anybody a bum.
Yeah,
but I don't think Dwight Powell is a bum per se.
No,
I think he's got some skills.
I think if Graf was going to be totally honest with you too, he would remember back to some of the games where the Mavs had like 5 guys out and Powell was going for 20 and 10. That might have actually been before Graf was here, but I know exactly what you're talking about, JD. It was like Dwight Powell. J.J. Barea, a couple other random Mavericks players.
You'd be like, well, hold on, this man is giving Anthony Davis work. Who is this?
Right.
Well, all I know is this because he also did bring this up too. Watching the OKC Dallas series is like watching the Falcons and Bucks. He does not like it.
That's what happens when you're home instead of being in the playoffs.
No doubt about it. But it is interesting to kind of get that prayer. But look, to the point, as we've learned in this podcast, being a physical player, being somebody who can impact the game. And look, even to your point, you still remember him doing some work. Graf does remember. But in that particular game, that night, he helped them win a game. And we have seen this year, Naji Marshall on a particular night help win a game.
Yeah, and you get that from a guy like that. Again, you need, I think, every team needs a guy like that, and preferably he's a 6'10" dude who's an enforcer too. But I think you need a guy like that because everybody feeds off of him. And there were a couple of games where he and Alvarado came off the bench where, I mean, the Pelicans were somewhat lifeless. And they go in and they change the complexion of the game, picking up full court. And Naji stole the whole, Alvarado, the whole GTA thing, Grand Theft Alvarado. He kind of stole that out of his pocket because he started being the guy who was sneaking up on people, making steals. But you need guys like that who just inject energy and exude it about themselves. And you need guys who don't look at the opponent and say, I respect this guy. You can respect him before the game. You can respect him after the game. Mm-hmm. But during the game, you got to get up in his hip pocket and you got to make him do something. And you got to make him feel uncomfortable. And I think he's one of those guys.
Well, I will say this. Players today like to have a team around them. Jim has a large team of people around him as well. But I would say, if I'm Naji Marshall, having JD and the conductor Chris Moran at his side, he is set. He is good wherever he walks around.
That dude, I don't care where he plays in the NBA the rest of his career. That is a dude that is near and dear to my heart. Now, it kind of started kind of jovial and jokey. Mm-hmm. And then the more I watched him, I was like, you know what? I can appreciate this guy because of the way he goes about his business, because he knows who he is. He knows who he is. He's not out there trying to do something crazy. You don't see him shooting logo threes.
Right.
But you see him, if there's an open three to be taken, he'll take it. And he's developed enough to where he feels comfortable enough to take it. But he's a guy who does a lot of the dirt stuff that a lot of people just don't want to do. And I appreciate that about him.
John DeShazier, analyst for the radio network, for the Pelicans radio network, as always, giving us some insightful insight. Does that make sense? Can I do that? Can I say insightful insight? Do you ever write that, John?
Why not?
I mean, you're a writer.
Well, I don't, but I wouldn't write that because it's just like the same word back to back. So I wouldn't do that. Although every now and then you put like that behind each other. So
there you go. So
insightful
insight.
It just depends on how you use it.
Same thing. Do you see why I talk? And I can't really do that very well either as well. I think we're going to get you again for Dyson Daniels. So stay tuned.
That's right.
For more with John DeShazier. In the meantime, thanks for tuning us in. Our thanks as always for I think he enjoyed that. Don't you? I think he enjoyed it.
I think he enjoyed it even more than we did, Gus.
There's no doubt about it.
It was a good time.
I'm looking at my phone waiting to see if the conductor, Chris Moran, is unhappy. Either way, the draft lottery took place this past weekend here as well, Jim. And when we look at how it went, the Atlanta Hawks win it.
Huge winner. I mean, for them to be able to go, I think it was 3% chance that they had to get the number one pick and less than a 10% chance of finishing in the top 3. So that was massive. That came out of nowhere. I feel like when people were thinking of, and granted, there hasn't been a lot of people thinking about the lottery this year, but the people that were, I don't think anyone had the Hawks on their board as a team that could jump up. I mean, you're thinking more about the teams in the bottom of the standings. So I think the Hawks were definitely a clear winner, literally, of the lottery. There's a couple other teams, too, that come to mind. The Houston Rockets were supposed to be more kind of middle, late lottery. They moved up all the way to number 3, so that's huge. The Wizards ended up second. We saw the Spurs ended up with 2 lottery picks as well. So, I mean, maybe not good news for the rest of the Southwest Division that the Rockets end up 3. The Spurs end up with the 4th and the 8th pick. And then on the downside, we have the Detroit Pistons, who again finished with the worst record in the league and again dropped down to 5th. So those were some of the most interesting developments of the draft lottery. We'll see how everything unfolds. I think a lot of people are curious to see whether, some of the things that happened at the lottery that came out of nowhere, including the Hawks moving up to number 1, does that mean that how does that affect their offseason? Are they more willing to do trades? Are they going to consider a different direction for their franchise, given that they have that asset? So I think it was definitely not a very highly watched lottery, but it was one of the most interesting ones I think we've seen, just from the standpoint of there were so many surprising things that happened. And another thing, too, that I should throw in, Memphis dropped down a couple spots. So there were definitely some good and bad in terms of if you're rooting for a team in the Western Conference or a team in the Southwest Division like the Pelicans.
Yep, no doubt as well. As always, give Jim a follow. Jim_Eichenhofer is the way to do so as well. And as always, we appreciate you for tuning us in right here on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcast. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.